16th chapter of Exodus, and really we should read the whole chapter, but we're not going to. We're going to read the first 15 verses. Israel has come out of Egypt. Pharaoh's army has been destroyed, and they have celebrated with song and dance their deliverance from Egypt. They had a brief, if you look at the 15th chapter, the 22nd verse, they come to a place, I think it's pronounced Elim or Elim. It's an oasis, and they have had some respite there. But now they're moving out into the desert. The whole Israelite community set out from Elim and came to the desert of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the second month after they had come out of Egypt. In the desert, the whole community grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The Israelites said to them, "If only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted, but you have brought us out into this desert to starve this entire assembly to death." Then the Lord said to Moses, "I will rain down bread from heaven for you. The people are to go out each day and gather enough for that day. In this way, I will test them and see whether they will follow my instructions. On the sixth day, they are to prepare what they bring in, and that is to be twice as much as they gather on the other days." So Moses and Aaron said to all the Israelites, "In the evening you will know that it was the Lord who brought you out of Egypt. And in the morning you will see the glory of the Lord, because he has heard your grumbling against him. Who are we that you should grumble against us?" Moses also said, "You will know that it was the Lord when he gives you meat to eat in the evening and all the bread you want in the morning, because he has heard your grumbling against him. Who are we? You are not grumbling against us, but against the Lord." Then Moses told Aaron, "Say to the entire Israelite community, 'Come before the Lord, for he has heard your grumbling.'" While Aaron was speaking to the whole Israelite community, they looked toward the desert, and there was the glory of the Lord appearing in the cloud. The Lord said to Moses, "I have heard the grumbling of the Israelites. Tell them, at twilight you will eat meat, and in the morning you will be filled with bread. Then you will know that I am the Lord your God." That evening quail came and covered the camp, and in the morning there was a layer of dew around the camp. When the dew was gone, thin flakes like frost on the ground appeared on the desert floor. When the Israelites saw it, they said to each other, "What is it?" For they did not know what it was. Moses said to them, "It is the bread the Lord has given you to eat." Dear Lord, I've studied and I've prayed and I've read and I've thought, but right now, Lord, all of that, and it's necessary, will suffice, will not be sufficient, only unless you help me and this crowd, this people. So I'm asking you for that help right now, in Jesus' name. Amen. So we go back to the beginning of the chapter, and they have come out. They've had a little respite at an oasis somewhere. Who knows, there may have been trees with fruit on them. The Bible doesn't say. But they're a long way, and there's desert between them and what we call the Promised Land. After this time of refreshment, and they've had a great celebration, there's been singing and dancing, and there's been, it's been wonderful. But they faced the desert. They faced the desert. And the whole community grumbled against Moses and Aaron. Now, it's interesting, and they get kind of specific. The Israelites said to them, "If only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted. But you have brought us out into this desert to starve this entire assembly to death." Now think about it with me for a moment. They were in a strange place, and I think it's fair to say they may have hardly known who Yahweh, the Lord, They had a 400-year-old history in Egypt. They were in a nation where many gods were worshipped. We know from Joshua 24 that they brought some of those gods out with them. And for them to think that the Lord was the greater God or the true and living God probably was beyond their ability to fully comprehend. And they were facing real hardship. I've never been to a desert, and I've never faced the kind of thing they did, but what they were facing was not, they were not just hoping for an easy life. This was real to them. We all have physical bodies, and our bodies have appetites and drives, and some of those are essential and some aren't. All of us are here today because human beings have a sexual drive. There's a sexual component to us, and at some point, two people got together, and here we were. And maybe they all regretted it pretty early on, but here we are. But you can live without sex. People do it all the time. Even married people do. Sometimes because of age or illness or complications in life, not every person can enjoy a sexual relationship with someone else. So it's a drive. It's a real part of us. Men kind of think of it as a force, but you can live without it. We all need to be loved. We all need to have people in our lives who love us. And if you don't get that, you will be crippled. There are children who grow up who maybe even have a mother and father in the house, but they're not loved. They're not. And there's an emptiness, and they may never fully recover from that unless God just comes and helps them some way. And through the work of the Holy Spirit, or maybe counseling, or whatever things are available, they can get past all of that. But you can live without human love, and people unfortunately do that from time to time. But there are certain things you cannot do without, and food is one of those things. Their request for food was not unreasonable. I don't know how long you can go without food. Most of us really don't know. We've never tried to see how long you can go. But you can go a long time. And when people are sick, I remember a lady in my church who was, she was kind of padded like a lot of us get as we get older. And she had a serious illness. And she told me once, I went to see her in the hospital, and she said, I went 28 days on ice chips. She said, that's really hard on a fat person. We can go without food for a while, but if you're facing a desert and there's no sign of vegetation with fruit or produce on it, and there's just nothing but sand and horizon above, empty skies, it's daunting. And they said, if only we had died in Egypt. Many times, as we've looked at these texts over the last few weeks, we found out that deliverance was not always preferable to slavery. There's something strange about us. We have a tendency, some people will get saved out of a horrible lifestyle, and they have a tendency at times when it gets tough to live this new life of following God. They look back and they say, hey, it was better than this before. Now, again, think with me. Was it really? You know the story. Moses shows up. They've been inducted into forced labor. They're Pharaoh's slaves, basically. They're literally wage slaves. People talk about wage slavery today. This was real wage slavery. It exists in the world today. There have been a couple of news reports recently about the palm oil industry. And I'm told that palm oil shows up in cosmetics and in food products. But many of the people there in, Malaysia? There are certain places in the Far East where palm oil is harvested. And many of the people who work in that business are virtually slaves. And they do it to make bankers rich. So that sort of thing exists today, but this was a reality for Israel. And when Moses showed up and said, we'd like to go out into the desert and worship, they just made everything harder with no decrease in the required quota that was expected to be accomplished at the end of the day. This idea that they just sort of sat around the pots and had all the meat they wanted, hey, stew again for dinner, that probably was a gross exaggeration. Slaves usually don't sit around for lengthy meals with good conversation. They really don't. Things look so bad, we're going to die out here, and probably we may last a week or 2 weeks, but eventually we're just going to drop dead, and our bodies will be covered over by the sand, and they'll never even know anything unless someone comes along and scuffs open a little place in the sand, and they see some bones there. That's the end. And compared to that, looking back, Egypt seemed pretty good, but it couldn't have been that good. All the food they wanted, they didn't have time to eat. You brought us out into this desert to starve this entire assembly to death. Move on to verse 4. Then the Lord said to Moses, I will rain down bread from heaven for you. The people are to go out each day and gather enough for that day. In that day, now don't miss this, I will test them and see whether they will follow my instructions. The provision came with the test. Let's keep moving. On the 6th day, they're to prepare what they bring in, and that is to be twice as much as they gather on the other days. Now, why were they to do that? Because what was the 7th day of the week? Sabbath. That's right. These people who were living in a pagan land, and in probably many ways were pagans in their thinking, were being trained and taught that there's a different way to live. Slaves do not get a day off. Slaves do not get a day of rest and worship. Now, in the United States, we sort of have a dim view of doing nothing. We think that's sinful. And if people are doing nothing and surviving financially, we just have a tendency to think they're lazy. But it's not the way God planned. Now, the history of our Sunday worship, we don't technically observe Sabbath. We observe the Lord's Day. And I'm not an expert on it, but I've read about 4 or 5 books recently on the transition. Early on, Christians, some of them did participate in Sabbath worship because many of the earliest Christians were Jewish people. And of course, for them, Sabbath, that was the day of worship. You'd go to the synagogue. Then the Gentiles began to come in, and some of them observed the Jewish Sabbath. But then sometimes, because most of them, not all, but many of them were poor, and this was in Rome where there were maybe millions of slaves, certainly thousands of slaves, they could not take a day off and go to church, but they would meet early in the morning before the workday began, and they would gather and they would worship together. And after Constantine had his conversion there around 313 AD and made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire, he established Sunday as a day of worship. God wants us to take a day of worship, and that is challenged on every hand. You know, when I was a kid, we had blue laws, and some of our understandings about Sunday have literally been puritanical. We were influenced by the Puritan immigrants who came over there, and some of their ideas about Sunday were just ridiculous. There's a story told about a man who came home from the sea, and he was a captain of a boat, and his wife met him at the door, and he kissed her. And because this was considered indecent, he ended up in the stocks. You think, wow, well, that's the truth. The Puritans, and maybe their zeal was motivated by a desire to please God, but some of the things that we ask of people to do or not to do on Sunday, the Lord's Day, were just absolutely ridiculous and over the top. But, and I know you've heard me say this, what has happened today when we loosened those laws and eventually they all just went away, is we've made ourselves into a culture where poor people hardly ever get a Sunday off. If you work in a big box store, or if you work fast food or convenience store, many of those people never get a Sunday off. Why? Because we're all out there shopping, buying milk and bread and hamburgers or whatever else. And not only that, and I don't say this to irritate anybody, but it's the truth. A few years ago, our say, well, you guys aren't doing anything on Sunday, you'll come play ball. So we do. And it's robbed us of what we desperately need. Sabbath, or for us, the Lord's Day, it is not obligation, it is a gift. It is a gift. I've had times in my life when I've worked 7 days a week and I thought I had to. It's not healthy physically, emotionally, psychologically, and it's certainly not healthy spiritually. We all need a day that is set aside for God. Now, many churches today, and I don't know if this started with Tom Rainer, but he wrote a big book called Simple Church. Many churches today will say, we have adopted an approach of simplicity. The programmatic approach we've had to church for so many years, where something's going on every night for every age group, has not proven to be as effective as, it's just sort of worn us all out. But we still need a day where we stop and reflect. And I don't want to be legalistic about this, but we need a day. The Jewish Sabbath began on Friday night. And I had the tremendous once-in-a-lifetime privilege of being in Jerusalem to celebrate a Sabbath there. And there was a meal, and there was good food, and there was wine. And man, it was great at our table because there were 4 of us who didn't drink. And man, the other 4, they got twice as much. And they did not complain one bit. They were never so happy to be hanging out with Nazarenes in their lives. Yes, I'll have some more, please. But the whole city shut down. To acknowledge the presence of God. I don't know how many Jewish people really are devout these days, but in Jerusalem, Sabbath is practiced. And the next morning it was quiet until about noon, and then you could hear the sound of children's voices in the streets as they were allowed to go out and play. I do not nostalgically pine for some good old golden era in America, but we need to go back to acknowledging God by saying we will set aside a day when we worship Him. Amen. And that was the whole point of this thing. You train the people. You make your preparations for Sunday or Saturday for them on Friday night. And He was training them, trying to teach them what Sabbath was all about. Now, I need to move on while I'm behind, which is not unusual for me. Anyway, Moses and Aaron said to all the people, in the evening you will know that it was the Lord who brought you out of Egypt. Verse 7, and in the morning you will see the glory of the Lord, because He has heard your grumbling against Him. Who are we that you should grumble against us? Now listen to this. Later in this narrative, God will say, I'm sick of your grumbling. If you don't stop it, there will be consequences. But at this point, He accepts their grumbling and considers it prayer. I don't think God likes grumblers, and we don't really like grumblers, do we? Preachers deal with grumbling from time to time. Politicians do. Owners of businesses do. Heads of schools do. School principals and teachers. I mean, so many people deal with it, and it's never a good thing. But God accepts these people where they are, and He hears their grumbling, and He says, I'm going to answer it. As far as I'm concerned, this may be the best they can do right now spiritually. So I'm going to accept this as legitimate prayer. In verse 8, Moses also said, you will know that it was the Lord when He gives you meat to eat in the evening and all the bread you want in the morning, because He has heard your grumbling against Him. Again, he asked this question, who are we? You are not grumbling against us, but against the Lord. Verse 9, then Moses told Aaron, say to the entire Israelites community, come before the Lord, for He has heard your grumbling. While Aaron was speaking to the whole Israelite community, they looked toward the desert. There was the glory of the Lord appearing in the cloud. How do we know when the glory of the Lord is in a can't drum it up. We can't make it happen. We can only ask and try to get out of the way and not be a hindrance or a problem for him to be here. But we need to sense the presence of the Lord when we are gathered together. I think we need that desperately. And they saw the glory of God, and he comes to reveal himself to us. He wants to reveal his character, who he is, what kind of person he is. He's not like all of these Egyptian gods. You know, in my Bible reading, I've been in Isaiah, and in Isaiah and Jeremiah, they talk time and time again to Jewish people, quit going after these foreign gods. They're nothing more than projections of your own imagination. You got in the tree, you cut down a piece of tree, and you use some of it to cook over, and then you take some of it and you form it in the fashion of an image, and you cover it, maybe if you're really rich, with silver or gold, and you put it on a shelf, and you say, here's my God, and he's telling you, don't do that. And God shows up in his glory to reveal to them who he is, and not only that, but that he will be with them as they go through the desert. I'm not going to leave you alone when you go through this time in your life. Verse 11. The Lord said to Moses, verse 12, I have heard the grumbling of the Israelites. Tell them, at twilight you will eat meat, and in the morning you will be filled with bread. Then you will know that I am the Lord your God. Verse 13. That evening quail came and covered the camp, and in the morning there was a layer of dew around the camp. When the dew was gone, thin flakes of frost on the ground, light frost rather, on the ground appeared on the desert floor. And when the Israelites saw it, they said to each other, what is it? For they did not know what it was. And that's where the word manna, or manu in Hebrew, comes from. Moses said to them, it is the bread the Lord has given you to eat. Now they struggled with this. Their first failure was in hoarding. If you go home and read the rest of the chapter, you'll see this. Some of them thought, well, and they were given an exact measurement. But, we should relate to this, Americans. You go over to your fast food place, you have small, and medium, large, extra large. And you remember the big gulps at the 7-Eleven convenience store? Yeah. I mean, you can get soft drinks, for example, by the half gallon. And these are considered single serving for Americans. So you want a single burger, or a double, or a triple. And you can not only get a triple, but you can get bacon on that. 2 layers of cheese. And in America, this is called a single serving. Now, the Israelites didn't have Arby's or McDonald's, but they thought this is just not really enough. And so they hoarded it. And what happened? In the morning, it was full of maggots. Some of this is kind of hard to reconcile. But anyway, they did. And hoarding was their first thing. And then they struggled with believing that you could get enough on Friday to hold you through the Saturday Sabbath. They struggled with this. But there are 2 things out of this narrative that still are talked about even today, and they show up in the New Testament. Jesus is teaching out in the wilderness, and people are following him. And my guess is that many of these people are poor. They may be day laborers. And in that time and place, a day laborer was someone who showed up, and you probably remember the parable that Jesus told about people, waiting to be called to work, and some are hired in the morning, and some are hired around noon, and some are hired late in the day, and the argument is over, why do they all get paid the same? But these people maybe were people who only got paid on the day they worked, and if they got paid, they ate, and if they didn't work and they didn't get paid, they didn't eat. They really lived on a subsistence level income. So when Jesus shows up, and out of nothing, or out of nearly nothing, a little boy's lunch, has enough food to feed 5,000 people, it's not really humanly unreasonable to think, hey, we'd like to have more. And they show up, you read this in John chapter 6 or so, they show up and they say, Moses gave our forefathers bread. He gave our forefathers manna to eat. And the implication was, you should do this. And this was the kind of leader they wanted. They had hard lives. These were not some soft, indolent people who were just looking for another layer of welfare system in their government. These were people who really did have legitimate needs, and they were saying, if you really want to win this thing, let's have some more loaves and fishes. But he says to them, and you'll have to read this yourself to confirm it. He said, it wasn't Moses, but it was your Father in heaven who gave bread to eat. And then he said this, I am the bread that has come down from heaven. You know what their response was? They grumbled. Some things never change, do they? We know about loaves and fishes, barley loaves or whole wheat loaves or white loaves. We know about fish, tuna and salmon and swordfish and all that. But to have someone say, your Father gives bread, not Moses, and I am the bread that has come down from heaven, they grumbled at that. That's not going to fill our bellies. Here's the thing. I have physical drives, and I have physical appetites, and I have legitimate physical needs. But what I don't always even know about myself is that I have hungers that I'm not even fully aware of at times that are greater than physical. I'm not just a physical person or an emotional person. I am those things. Certainly I am. But I am a spiritual person. And I have spiritual needs. And my spiritual needs are greater than my physical needs. They're greater than my need for bread or fish or water or whatever. And Jesus says, I am the bread of life. And I know your needs. I know your needs. And one of the things that it means to be a Christian is to go and accept Jesus' message about me and his verdict on my life and his telling me that I have needs that only he can meet. And to accept that. To say, I will live in submission to you and realize that you are the only person. I can have all my physical needs met. I can have all my sexual needs met. I can have what I consider all my emotional needs met and still be empty spiritually. And if that is true, I am impoverished as a person. No matter how fat my wallet is, how nice my car is, how big my house is, how pretty my girlfriend or wife or whatever may be. And he's saying to these people, yes, I know you're hungry. He fed them because he had compassion on them. He did. They're hungry. And he proved to them that he could meet their physical needs. But he said, you have hungers in your heart and soul that you aren't even fully aware of most of the time until the grace of God comes to you and points out. Now, where do we struggle with that? Why would you grumble? Because we don't want to admit we have spiritual needs. We're Americans. We want to pretend we're resilient and we're self-made people and we don't bow down to anyone. And certainly we don't want to admit the times and places where we have failed. All have. Paul, writing to the church in Rome, said all have sinned. All have sinned. Everyone. The Jewish people have, the Gentile people have. Everyone has sinned and fallen short of God's glory. There's no person on the planet who's never fallen short of the glory of God in some way or the other. And we deal with that primarily, and I know I've said this sort of thing many times, by comparing ourselves to other people that we think have fallen a lot further than we have. If I can just find somebody who's a bigger sinner than I am, it makes me feel good about myself. This idea that God wants to sustain me, not just physically. We're told in what we call the Lord's Prayer, and we should pray it every day, we're told to ask for daily bread. And we all need daily bread. We all need food and shelter and clothing. But If you're a fan of Tolkien, which I am, you know, there are waybreads mentioned in those books. One is cran. Cran. The word says it all, doesn't it? What are you eating? Cran. But the elves had a bread called lembas. They gave it to the travelers in leaves. You never got tired of it. You consumed it, and you would run out and need more, but you never got tired of elvish way bread. And the bread that Jesus gives to us can be partaken of over and over and over again. And we think about the Exodus every time we celebrate communion. We look all the way back to those stories in Exodus, to the Passover meal. And how do we remember Passover? How do Jewish people remember Passover? With a book? Primarily with a meal. Now, what we're going to do today is not a meal. In John Wigger's great book, American Saint, about Francis Asbury, it's a marvelous book. It's a real scholarly treatment of the life of Asbury, who was the second most recognized person in America in his day. He talks about the love feast that the early Methodists had. He doesn't go into a lot of detail, but you didn't just show up in church and get a little wafer and a little cup and take it and go home. They celebrated. I'm not sure how often, weekly, quarterly. Our communion practices have varied from church to church and even from time to time. But we take of this and we remember it's a time of deliverance. And all the names mean something. Why do we call it the Lord's Supper? Because he initiated it and said, whenever you do this, do it in remembrance of me. We call it communion because our hope and goal is that as we take of these elements, we're not just taking physical elements, but we are receiving spiritually in some way the very life of Christ. We believe, as Nazarenes, and whether you are or not, you're here and you want to become one, we believe that Jesus is spiritually present when we take this. And we also, not so much in our tradition, but in others, we speak of this as Eucharist. We have a sacrament that says thanks. We have a sacrament called thanks. Now, in my lifetime, and probably yours too, the participation in the communion service, the Eucharistic celebration, the Lord's Supper has always been one of solemnity. You would approach, if we did, come to the altar, or however it was done, and we can hand out trays here, pass trays. You do it with reverence. I think that's fine, but we must never forget this is a time of Thanksgiving, and we're thinking all the way back to slaves in Egypt. And God is coming. He says, I'm going to bring you out, and you're going to have a meal, and you'll carry on this meal for all eternity. And every time you take it, you'll remember that you were slaves, or your forefathers were. But now you are free because of what I have done for